Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Davos. The fraying transatlantic relationship is in transition, to say it diplomatically, amid U.S. tariff threats over Greenland. Adam Tooze, the Columbia University history professor, has detailed knowledge of the issue. On the sidelines of the World Economic Forum annual meeting, I asked him about the recent interactions across the Atlantic. And here is his analysis. Now, your takeaway in terms of the nature of a transatlantic relationship?
It's very strained, it has to be said. We've just heard President Trump's speech, and it was, as some people predicted, conciliatory, you might say, or at least it was a declaration that he isn't going to invade Greenland, Denmark, Iceland. This is good news. But the general mood here is one of incredible tension, alienation, bewilderment, surprise, confusion, anguish, pain. I mean, I have dealt with some of the Trump people these days, and it is very hard work to handle them. They are very, very aggressive. It's just professionally difficult to do. And I think that sense is running across everyone here. And it is specifically the Europeans, I think.
We've been hearing speeches coming from the European leaders, whether it is the EU commissioner or it is the French president, and the list goes on. Now, do you see there's any consensus among them?
It really is. I think we heard from the people who spoke up vocally a kind of unanimity, which is not that we aren't willing to talk with the United States about what America's interests in Greenland are, but an absolute refusal of coercion, whether it's by means of tariffs, let alone by military means, as a way of addressing those concerns. That, I think, is the bottom line on the European side. No coercion, no violence. Amongst somebody that you think of as your allies, between you and your allies, there cannot be that mode of interaction. And the Trump administration finds that hard to deal with because they actually desire, they like the bullying element. It's more and more clear from every interaction that you have that that's a key part of their policy. So I think that is a bottom line. But it is notable we haven't heard from everyone in the same way, and the central problem of concerting European opinion remains. The big issue for Europe, it has to be said, is Ukraine. This is the key issue. The national security concern of the East remains the abiding European preoccupation. I think it explains Europe's policy throughout this first year of the second Trump administration. And that's where you will also see very considerable differences. And the willingness, therefore, of people to compromise or stand relatively firm depends on that.
Talking about that, it's very interesting to see the European list of things urgent to deal with the United States. It's getting ever longer.
Yes.
For example, it's, as you said, Ukraine, there's also Greenland, and there's tariff, and there are many other things.
Digital regulation.
Exactly. So what does that mean for the Europeans? Is the United States already exerting enough pressure for the Europeans to crack?
Well, I think actually what we've seen, the optimistic reading, is that it's exerting enough pressure for the Europeans to consolidate. And I don't regret President Trump telling us that he's not going to invade Greenland. That is a considerable source of relief. I never thought I'd say that, but I, this afternoon, feel relieved. But what I worry about is that having disappeared as a threat, that the energy that we were seeing in the first couple of days of this week will begin to ebb away. And that, I think, will be really regrettable, because everyone who has watched this relationship, since, you could say, even the Obama period, because Obama was a professional international politician, but he was cool on Europe. Cool. The first Trump administration should have been the wake-up call. I think, unfortunately, the Biden administration, which was classically Atlanticist, put the Europeans back to sleep. And now they're waking up again. And I think this is a tendency, this has got to be something we have to fight. Europe has to understand the need to stand on its own 2 feet. It will, in fact, be better for its relations, I think, both with the United States and with China, if Europe is stabilized as a single coherent actor, able to clearly state and rationally argue for its interests.
Yeah. Let's take a look at what has happened since the earlier few months ago. First of all, there was the Munich Security Conference last year, famously for the divorce between the United States and Europe. And then we also see the national security paper coming out of Washington, describing European continents probably has an even more threat than some of the other earlier believed the so-called rivals. Yeah. So, and now we are seeing the World Economic Forum related to Greenland and other topics. So how do you see the evolution of this discussion and also the interaction between the two sides?
What is fascinating is that this is a kind of multi-stranded push. And what we saw at Munich was led by Vice President Vance. And Vance, for me, stands for a cultural revolution, a culture war politics, which he took very aggressively to Munich. It was basically an accusation against mainstream European parties that they marginalize the far-right parties that the MAGA Trump people feel themselves aligned with. So it was a kind of line struggle across transatlantically, with Vance demanding more space for his political friends. That ran through the whole year and manifested very loudly in the national security strategy, which downplayed ideological divides, conflicts between the United States and China or with Russia. It sort of took those for granted. Different systems, different rules, different ideologies, okay. But with Europe, it's different, because the MAGA campaign in the US, which does think of itself as kind of pushing a cultural revolution, understands that it has no business talking about Chinese politics or Russian politics. But Europe is the extension and the echo chamber, and places like Davos quintessentially are zones where liberal Americans, the professional managerial class of America, goes for inspiration, consolidates its values, learns from the Europeans, and vice versa. And we've seen Gavin Newsom here, who's clearly in his element, John Kerry, that entire old guard of American liberalism. Al Gore comes back every year. This is their stomping ground. And the MAGA people quite correctly sense that confronting Europe is part of their domestic political struggle.
However, the issue of energy is for real.
Yes.
How do you see the element of energy, lifeline for Europe to prosper, played in this transatlantic relationship, for now at least?
Oil for the Europeans is a stable thing. Europe has been saturated with oil for decades. It's not a booming market. We're really talking about electricity generation. And so we're talking about the trade-off really between gas, wind, solar, and batteries. Right. Those are the real options. And what the Europeans realized during the Ukraine conflict is the dependence on pipelined Russian gas was very risky for them because of the geopolitics. And there was a lurch towards two things: accelerate renewables, solar and wind, in using large quantities of Chinese solar panels to do the solar build out. Wind is different, that's done more domestically, and buying American LNG. And the president, with his pro-American oil and gas producers hat on, is a export gas president. He goes around the world doing these giant LNG deals, and the Europeans side up to one. The problem is that he's also a low energy cost for American consumers president, which is totally in conflict with his commitment to the interests of the American oil producers. And so with that hat on, he's a let's go and take control of Venezuelan oil and pump that into the market and help to bring oil prices down. And so there's as with so many things in the Trump project, there's these deep contradictions between his commitment to energy dominance and what does it really mean? Does that mean cheap energy for American consumers or big markets for American producers? Opening up the big market for American producers might reduce the pressure on the American market, but there's very little coherence in his thinking about these basic issues, which is not just a Trump problem. It's a conflict inherent in America's situation, which is that it is a oil power and a gas power, both as a producer and a consumer. And that puts you constantly in conflict with yourself.
But the question really is, how is Europe likely as a continent to deal with the choking point of energy supply?
The solution is new energy types. I mean, that's the direction. They made promises to Trump, they're not going to keep them. The promises they made to Trump are really, I thought this was us, the Europeans, engaging in fake news, because there's no central gas purchasing agency in Europe that can say, yes, we will buy hundreds of billions of dollars of American gas. European firms, European generators decide how much gas they take. So the actual solution is going to be a renewable build-out.
We have been seeing some interesting signs in rhetorics, at least. Yeah. For example, about the Anti-Coercion Act.
Yes.
For example, about technology sovereignty. For example, about whether to purchase or not technologies coming from the US that might have a huge impact on European security, or vice versa, whether Europeans want to share those technologies, drones, for example, with the United States. So what do you make of these, shall I say, flowing on the surface suggestions.
Yes.
Are they really serious, or are they just tricks being thrown out for negotiation's sake?
I mean, I think that they are negotiating ploys, but as in any relationship, the harder the talk, the more aggressive the talk, the more deeper values begin to erode. And I think we are definitely at the point now where that tactical moving, the kind of aggressive actions that people are showing and the rhetoric that's being deployed is eating away at the trust which underpins the entire relationship. You cannot describe your relations, say, as the Americans have with the Europeans in recent weeks, without fundamentally undermining the willingness of other people to work with you. And you could see the shock in President Macron of France, when he said it would be crazy if the anti-coercion instrument, which was intended for use against Russia and, let's face it, against China, over rare earths, for instance, that's what the Europeans imagined coercion to look like, if it would have to be actually used for the first time against the United States. And that level of kind of disbelief almost is beginning to move through the European system and change attitudes in quite a deep way.
The EU recently have been having one of the largest trade pacts in history. And look at those economies. They are, so to speak, in the backyard of the United States and in the middle of what the US described as so-called Western Hemisphere, according to the recent national security paper.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's important to say that this new version of the Monroe Doctrine is obviously grotesque. I mean, it's an entirely inappropriate claim to authority and power of the United States over the Western Hemisphere. And even if they can make it stick against the Venezuela, they can't make it work against a Mexico or a Brazil. Argentina is in such bad shape that Milei is quite heavily dependent on Trump, but that's because they're in crisis. I don't need to tell you that Brazil's major trading partner is not Europe or the United States, but China. The same for Chile, the same for much of Latin America now, thanks to the very constructive, heavily investment-driven policy that China has pursued. I think Europe thinks of itself as catching up with China, and all of them are basically just ignoring the silly noise coming out about Monroe doctrines from the United States. No one can take it seriously. It's absurd. If America was seriously interested in Latin America, it would have had a Latin American investment, trade policy, a migration policy to actually open up that corridor and make it powerful and generative. NAFTA with Mexico would not just be a trade deal, it would be like the EU, it would be a Schengen area, none of that, right? So the United States has failed in the historic opportunity of actually building a cultural, political, social unit out of the Western Hemisphere. And so not surprisingly, China as the great source of demand for raw materials and Europe as the great rich market are also opening their doors. How much will come out of this, it's hard to tell because there's a lot of trade already. And the real missed opportunity is trade within Latin America. It's the fact that Brazilians and the Argentinians barely trade with each other. That's the real problem for them, I would say. Where we could go next, and von der Leyen mentioned this, is India. And the big trade deal would be a EU-India, the mother of all trade deals, right? That would be, it would be India-EU. That would be it's a complex trade deal. Indians are not easy to deal trade deals with. They are co-responsible for paralyzing WTO. And there's such a huge income differential between Europe and India that any kind of tight integration would be quite difficult to achieve. But it's steps in the right direction for sure. And I think that is the future, those sorts of bilateral, multilateral, but not fully comprehensive deals.
The ramifications of the interactions among stakeholders taking place then are still being felt today and being analyzed constantly. On the transatlantic relationship, for example, there are so many different views coming from all over the world as to what it means and what the rhetorics taking place at the World Economic Forum and the actions likely to follow would mean for the rest of the world. And here is my latest conversation with Professor Allison from the Kennedy School of Government with Harvard University. The President of the United States also mentioned in his speech the names of several European leaders.
Yes.
Especially
Macron.
French President Macron. So how would you describe this transatlantic relationship in terms of leadership interaction. What would you use in terms of adjectives?
That's a good question. So it's very interesting, even the contrast. If you say Macron, he demeans Macron. When he talked about Carney, our colleague in Canada, he was pretty negative. Trump is, in essence, a bully. He bullies weaker people. But when he meets someone that he believes as strong as he is, and who demonstrates a determination,
Right.
he has a degree of respect.
Personality is one thing, but what does this latest interactions between Brussels and major European continent and major European capitals vis-a-vis Washington mean for the transatlantic relationship, you think, Professor?
I would say the transatlantic relationship is more stressed today than it has probably ever been. It was stressed pretty seriously in 1956 when the British and the French sent their troops to Egypt for the for the canal, and President Eisenhower threatened even maybe to undermine the pound for Britain to get them to comply. So that was a very difficult period. There have been a couple of other very difficult periods. It was a period in which two members of the alliance, Greece and Turkey, were actually fighting over Cyprus. So, but in this case, the main pillar of the alliance is the U.S. To have the main pillar treating the other parties with such disrespect is leading the parties, the Europeans, to think, well, what can we do for ourselves? Now, that's not entirely bad. I think the proposition for strong countries like Germany and France and Britain to basically subcontract their security to the U.S. and to not take their role for their own security more seriously has been malfeasance on their part. But since I'm happy every day and every year that there's not a great power war.
How do you see this process? What does it say to you about the nature now of this relationship evolving?
The structure of the international order that we've known our whole lifetime is eroding very rapidly. One component of that is the trading system, and you can see with the tariffs. But another component is the Transatlantic Alliance. The Transatlantic Alliance is now stressed in a way that it hasn't been before. Countries like Canada are thinking about the U.S. as a potential threat. Well, excuse me, how countries in Europe think, can we depend on the Americans? If we can't depend on them, what is their alternative?
Yeah.
So a whole questions that nobody had even thought of asking for a long period of time are now. You didn't bring in Ukraine to make the thing more complicated. From Europeans' point of view, Putin, who has military force and shows he's prepared to use it, is succeeding in Ukraine and would be if the Americans were not particularly playing a major role in supporting the Ukrainians. But as he said, wait a minute, we're on the other side of the ocean. Why am I doing this for you? What are you doing about it? Why are you not doing more? So I would say once you get into that game, and once each of the parties begins to think, no longer are we in this partnership, we need to think of what I would say all sorts of big questions are being asked, and we're in a period of very major changes, some of which could be radical enough that you would say that couldn't possibly happen.
Allies and war, there's something in between.
Yeah.
So what is likely to be that? Are we in the beginning of something? Can you describe that something at this moment?
I think we're at the beginning of a creation of things that we don't yet know what they're going to look like. I think in principle, Europe should be more responsible for its own security. Europe has got 4 times the population of Russia, 10 times the GDP.
But they
Why
will
should
become
it be
more independent.
They would
and
be.
Therefore, they may not necessarily listen to the United
Absolutely.
States
So that would be
anymore.
back.
There will not be that many people packed in that Congress
That's
hall
true.
listening to your president.
Absolutely. So we've had periods in history where you have several great powers and they have to balance each other. If we look at the 19th century, after the Congress of Vienna in Europe, we get a balance of power system that shifts from time to time, but it was more or less successful in preventing major wars. So I would suspect we're into a period where we're going to be experimenting, and people will think of things that they hadn't thought of before. And the difficult problem for the Europeans is that
Experimenting, meaning the U.S. experimenting, and therefore Europeans
I'd say
respond to that?
all of them. So President Trump saying, you know, I'm threatening you with even military force, and then people keep telling him, no, that's, and he said, okay, I'm not going to do that. But if you listened earlier, he said, we're going to get this. He didn't say this today, but he used almost this gangster language. This is going to, you can either do this the hard way or the easy way, but I'm telling you, you're going to do this for me.